it's Marlene Anthony Love with Traveling While Black, and welcome to our fourth and final episode of our Travel While Black Across America Road Trip Series, Volume 2, Oregon Coast.
Yep, for this fourth and final episode, we are in the iconic, historic, and one of the most famous Oregon Coast cities. That city is Astoria. We can't wait to show you what you can find here. The next stop on our Oregon Coast road trip perhaps isn't as world-renowned as our previous stop, Cannon Beach, but for a large part of the population, especially those who came up in the 80s, Astoria, Oregon is home to a very familiar landmark from a generational cult classic, the Goonies House.
Actually, it can be argued that Astoria is as known as Cannon Beach because Goonies was just one of many movies that filmed in the northern Oregon coastal town. But it has to be the city's charm that attracts Hollywood productions, influenced by its Victorian-style architecture.
The Victorian aesthetic almost gives away that this is a city that is packed with history, combined with the continuation of great seafood and spectacular views. But these views are of the mighty Columbia River.
Astoria, like most destinations, has an interesting story that has led to why the city is the way it is today.
A history that you already know we were gonna jump into. Out of all the stops on our Oregon Coast road trip series, it could be argued that Astoria has the most colorful history of them all. Here's why.
For one, Astoria holds the title as being the oldest American settlement west of the Rockies. The city flourished thanks to the fur trade industry.
Early town success based on slinging fur makes a lot of sense, considering the city was founded by John Jacob Astor, the founder and owner of the Pacific Fur Company. Even though the indigenous Chinookan peoples ran an extensive fur trading network long before the Europeans. We'll touch on that later in the episode.
The fur game and contributing to the War of Great Britain and the United States is another reason for Astoria having the most colorful history. Astoria played a major role during the War of 1812. More on that also later in the episode.
The War of 1812 wasn't the only war Astoria was a part of the action. In World War II, the city played a key role in defending the Oregon coast. In fact, Astoria is where the only mainland U.S. military installation was attacked during the war, when Fort Stevens was shelled by a Japanese submarine in 1942.
And then, of course, there's a Hollywood connection. To be honest, the colorfulness of Astoria's history can be summed up just by its ability to transform itself from a global impacting fur-pushing hub, a popular tourist destination, attracting people and Hollywood with its blend of gritty, artsy, and historic vibes.
Astoria also has a few connections to Black history. On our trip to Astoria, we were excited to experience all of that in the northmost city on the Oregon coast. And the last stop on our Traveling While Black Across America road trip series, Volume 2, the Oregon coast.
Drive grade. For this whole road trip, each leg of the drive has only gotten better, with the last leg between Newport and Cannon Beach getting a perfect 10 out of 10. We weren't sure if it was possible to get better than that.
But we wouldn't be surprised if the drive from Cannon Beach to Astoria somehow figured it out. Even though this would be the shortest drive of the whole series, with an estimated drive time of around 40 minutes.
While just a 40-minute drive straight north up the 101 bodes well in regard to route difficulty, easily getting 2 points there, but with only 25 miles in between the two destinations, this leg would definitely be up against it in regards to roadside attractions.
The fact of the matter is that this leg of the drive has a secret weapon. See, between Cannon Beach and Astoria lays another pretty popular Oregon Coast tourist destination, Seaside.
More and more travelers looking for the ultimate beach town vibe flock to Seaside. It is actually home to the state's oldest oceanfront promenade, which was built in 1921, and offers a classic boardwalk feel.
They even host the largest beach volleyball tournament in the world. Yeah, Seaside offers a lot on its own. What we chose to experience within Seaside was the city's connection to Lewis and Clark's expedition.
Growing up, I heard a lot about the Lewis and Clark expedition. That's because my hometown of St. Charles, Missouri is where the expedition began. So it was really cool getting to experience all these places that they encountered on their journey firsthand.
Yes, living is a whole other level to just hearing about it. Throughout our journey in this part of the coast, we've already encountered some of those locations, like in Cannon Beach, in the village of Necas, where William Clark would trade with local tribes.
But Seaside represents a really significant milestone of the expedition.
So we're in Seaside, Oregon, where the Lewis and Clark Trail ends.
Here in Seaside, visitors can check out one of the unique locations connected to the expedition. like where some of the members of the expedition spent part of the winter making a vital mineral for the journey home. During Lewis and Clark's expedition, salt was a very vital thing. In fact, it was looking for salt that established this area right here. The Lewis and Clark Salt Works marks the place where members of the expedition spent part of the winter making salt, which would be crucial for the return trip home.
Those of you that are history geeks, you can go to nps.gov to find out more about the Lewis and Clark Trail that runs nearly 4,900 miles following the historic outbound and inbound routes of the Lewis and Clark expedition, starting in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and designating Seaside as the end. But that wasn't the end of the story.
Nope, their story on the Pacific coast continued up the road in Astoria, what is now the Lewis and Clark National Historical Park, Fort Clatsop. Seaside might claim the end of the Lewis and Clark Trail, but this fort right here is where the Lewis and Clark expedition really ended. It's where they took shelter during the winter before they headed back east. William Clark actually drew the blueprints for this fort. And believe it or not, those same blueprints were used to rebuild the replica that stands here today. The Lewis and Clark expedition wasn't the only story that offered a unique way to connect to Oregon coast history on this leg of the road trip.
We drove 20 miles west off of the planned path to Fort Stevens State Park to check out the part of the Oregon coast maritime history, the Peter Iredale Shipwreck.
These are the rusted remains of the ship named the Peter Iredale that ran aground in 1906. The wreck is accessible at low tide, attracting professional and amateur photo seekers, making it one of the most famous shipwrecks of the Oregon coast. The wind was crazy on our visit due to a storm brewing, so our pictures, they weren't the greatest.
Experiences like these that provide an opportunity to connect to significant parts of history, all within a city that's a popular tourist destination on the Oregon coast, is why we are giving 2 points for roadside attractions.
Seaside's proximity also makes it a perfect stop for filling up or grabbing snacks, so both points for roadside amenities. As for views, 2 points still, even in the short distance.
This leg of the road trip from Cannon Beach to Astoria possibly best exemplifies a common theme showcased in this series' drive grades. That distance does not dictate the quality of the drive. We absolutely enjoyed it as much as the others.
Even the parking in Astoria was great. Most importantly, free. So for the last leg of the TWB Cross America Road Trip Series Volume 2, we give a 10 out of 10 for drive grade.
Wow, looks like once again we were off to a great start, and we were excited to get to Astoria to see if the fun would continue. One thing is for sure, that drives on this road trip series have been some of the most fun experiences.
But Astoria will be our first experience on this road trip where we wouldn't spend a lot of time on the beach or in nature. This was going to be a different experience, but we were up for anything. Level of fun. As soon as we got to Astoria, it felt more like we were in a historic riverfront city than a traditional coastal beach town. It was evident that this was going to be a totally different experience than the previous destinations on this road trip.
Still in line with the other coastal towns, nature was in reach. For us, it was just right outside of our hotel in the form of mini sea lions that congregate on the docks below. We only spotted them on occasion, but they always let us know that they were there.
That's why our hotel provides earplugs to guests. The switch to more urban experiences was also perfect timing because at this part of the road trip, the weather had taken a turn, meaning any activity outside would be in the rain.
But this time of year, the Oregon coast is still a popular attraction thanks to a natural phenomenon that tons of visitors flock to experience every year, king tides.
Like their name suggests, king tides aren't just any Reggie tides. These are in fact the highest tides of the year, swells big enough to make beaches disappear, temporarily changing the landscape right before your eyes.
The major driver of these massive waves, the moon, happens to line up perfectly with the sun and the earth, typically November through February. That's why for a lot of visitors during this time of year, stormy weather is a treasured sight.
Astoria, as you would expect, is a prime location to catch these spectacular waves roll in with the storm. But this is not one of the activities we graded Astoria for in terms of quality of activities.
Inspired by the historic architecture and stories of its colorful history, and the rainy weather, of course, we decided to check out some of the museums within Astoria.
There are plenty to choose from, like the Columbia Maritime Museum. Its location on the Columbia River waterfront is the perfect place for a museum that tells the history of the waterway region known as the Graveyard of the Pacific.
But for our visit, as both of us are fans of movies and what goes into making them, the main museum we knew we had to check out was the Oregon Film Museum.
Thanks to the Adventure in History Pass, we took advantage of a deal that we couldn't pass up. 3 museums for $14.
That meant along with the Oregon Film Museum, we got to check out the Heritage Museum and the Flavel House Museum. This road trip experience was a lot more like the museum experiences that we had on our last road trip series, Volume 1.
Let's start with the Heritage Museum. Housed in Astoria's old City Hall, this museum features 2 floors that tell more of the all-around history of Astoria and Clatsop County than the other 2.
The Heritage Museum also does a great job highlighting more of the culturally diverse stories, as well as some of the colorful and gritty ones, and even the tragic ones.
One of the exhibits we were most interested in viewing at this museum was Blocked Out, Race and Place in the Making of Modern Astoria, which details the complex history of race and the development of Astoria.
Yes, going in, we were looking forward to it, but it was a lot.
Luckily, we had another museum to hit up that would lighten the mood a bit, the Flavel House Museum.
This museum is housed in an 1885 Queen Anne-style mansion that once belonged to one of Astoria's wealthiest and influential figures, Captain George Flavel.
This museum is less about exhibits as much as it's about showcasing how the Flavel family was luxuriously living back in the day. This museum, I would say, would be more for our folks who travel for architecture, I guess.
Finally, it was time to hit the next museum, which for us was the main event.
But where it was housed was interesting in itself. From 1914 to 1976, this building behind us was actually the operating county jail here in Astoria.
But now it's the Oregon Film Museum that houses some great interactive exhibits.
If you're a history buff, then this museum is definitely for you. The Oregon Film Museum celebrates the state's rich history and films. Did you know that the building it's in was the same Clatsop County jail that appears in the opening scene of Goonies?
This was probably one of our favorite museums because of the fact that it does not just connect visitors to the facts and artifacts of the most iconic films associated with Oregon's history, but it is also interactive. Yes, it is just as fun as it looks to be able to step onto recreated movie sets, touch behind-the-scenes props, and even film your own mini scene. Here's Johnny.
Just like any great film, the Oregon Film Museum lived up to its expectation. But experiencing places from iconic films in Oregon isn't only relegated to the museum. Nope, you can actually drive to locations featured in some of those films.
Yes, at the Film Museum, you can get a map that will show you where those places are, like the school from Kindergarten Cop, or the most iconic of all Oregon film landmarks, the Goonies House.
All in all, we really enjoyed our Astoria Museum Day. Who would have thought?
That's why we can give both points for quality of activities. Now, there are plenty of other things to do in Astoria, but even within just the museum experience, we feel that there is something for a variety of different visitor demographics.
That's why we can give both points for demographic applicability. The other criteria Astoria shines in is special events. Out of all the stops on our Oregon Coast road trip series, Astoria has the most widely attended and historically significant events. So both points here.
Now, in terms of affordability, these Northern Coast Oregon towns must pay for pricier air, because just like Cannon Beach, Astoria is on the more pricier side. So we only give it 1 point for affordability.
As far as restaurants go, we sort of struggled to find great restaurant options during our time, other than our hotel dining, so only 1 point here. Oh, but we did find a delicious bakery called The Naked Lemon.
And it's Black owned. After tallying all the points, Astoria comes out to a pretty good score. We give an 8 out of 10 for level of fun.
Well, I guess that means that Cannon Beach ends up with the lowest.
Still, the lowest scores being a 7 out of 10 show that the Oregon coast, no matter where you go, it's hard not to have a great time.
As for our comfort score, our bar of expectation was a little lower based on our other experiences. Still, like always, we were excited to put it up against our scale.
Comfortability for Black people. Well, here we are, the final stop on our Oregon Coast road trip series, and the final destination being put up against our specially made for Oregon comfortability scale.
Let's start with the criteria that has been consistent within all the destinations on this road trip, our personal comfort. Within Astoria, we encountered friendly people throughout our visit and had a welcoming experience overall. So like the previous destinations, we give both points here.
Other than the friendly encounters, the articles of inclusion also contributed to our comfortable experience. In Astoria, we saw a few pride artifacts and even a BLM artifact or two.
It was by far the most we've seen the whole road trip, so both points for artifacts of inclusion. As for Black people seen, even though we did see one Black woman that owned the bakery and was a longtime resident, we are still reluctant to give any points.
Here's why. Look, we ran into this powerful and courageous sister on the last day on the way out of town. But before that, we didn't even see one other Black person since the first day in Cannon Beach. Shoot, we barely seen them in the films featured at the Oregon Film Museum. So yeah, 0 points for Black people seen.
As for diversity and Astoria's destination marketing, at the time of our search, we didn't find a lot of marketing reflecting a lot of diversity, so no points here.
We couldn't really find any cultural resource groups in Astoria specifically, so no points. But there is an organization that is a great resource for Black people all over Oregon, or those interested in visiting Oregon, the Oregon Black Pioneers.
The Oregon Black Pioneers is a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and sharing the history of Black Oregonians. Find out more at their website at OregonBlackPioneers.org.
As for the final tally for Astoria, in regard to our comfortability grade, the scale comes out to a 4 out of 10.
Again, we modified this scale specifically for this road trip. That's because we felt in order to give it a more objective look, we have to look at it with a different lens because of Oregon being a state with a history of exclusion towards Black people.
Although it's ironic and somewhat fitting that the last stop on our Oregon Coast Road Trip series is a place that has somewhat of a connection to the origin of the state's exclusionary law.
James D. Sewells, a Black American sailor, lived near Astoria after the wreck of the USS Peacock, the expedition ship that brought him. He eventually moved to the Willamette Valley near Oregon City, where he would inadvertently and unfairly be associated with Oregon's first Black exclusion law of 1844.
The incident is known as the Cockstock Incident. Cockstock was a Molalla man. Customary for the time, he performed labor for a settler in return for payment. In this case, it was a horse.
Cockstock became upset when he discovered that the settler sold the horse to another settler, James D. Sewells.
The outrage caused Cockstock to raise a lot of trouble for the local settlers, including Sewells, which resulted in a $100 reward being put out for Cockstock's arrest.
Not long after, Cockstock, along with a few other Native men, came across a settler who he was employed by and who had promised him the horse. A skirmish broke out between the two groups that resulted in Cockstock, along with two white settlers, being mortally wounded. The event raised tensions in the region between the indigenous population and the settlers.
Enter in Congressman Samuel Thurston, who would use this as a perfect opportunity to push through his racist legislation. See, the settler that killed Cockstock was actually a freed Black man named George Winslow.
Thurston would use this and other incidents involving natives and a Black settler to ruse fears by associating Black people to having an aggressive nature that would continue to incite tensions with the native population.
The fact that Thurston specifically blamed Sewells and not Winslow, the person who actually killed Cockstock, reveals the real underlying fear for white men like Thurston. See, James D. Sewells was married to a Chinook woman, and he was known to often associate with Native peoples.
The other incident that sparked the legislation and only occurred but a few days prior to it being passed involved a dispute between James Sewells and a white settler in which Sewells allegedly threatened to incite the natives against the settler.
See, that's really what Thurston and the other white men a part of the Oregon Territory power structure feared, an interracial Black and Native alliance.
For his alleged threat, Sewells was arrested. Less than a month later, the Provisional Government of Oregon passed the first Black exclusion law. As a result, Sewells and other influential Black men like George Bush would end up in Washington State.
This event of blaming a tragic situation on a group of people and using it as an excuse to round them up, ship them out, and even ban them sounds a lot like what's happening today. Message!
While the exclusion laws is an unfortunate part of the Oregon State history, it also kind of makes our choice and ability to travel and enjoy everything amazing that the state has to offer that much more special. And our road trip up the Oregon coast was special. It was an all-time experience of a lifetime, taking in the natural beauty while experiencing a variety of coastal city experiences.
We can't forget about the interesting lessons in history, especially learning a little more about the rich indigenous cultures. We will never forget this road trip, or we will be back. And we hope that you also consider taking some time to hit up this beautiful part of the country.
Before we left out of state for home, we stopped by one more iconic Oregon Coast landmark in Astoria, the Astoria Columns.
Ironically, the Astoria Columns are also the last tribute to the Lewis and Clark expedition on our trip. We checked out the 125-foot tall monument, took in some views, then hit the Astoria Megler Bridge to head back home to the state of Washington.
We can't wait for our next road trip. And as always, we recommend you hitting up the open road and experiencing some of the parts of the country you've never been, even if on a whim.
We hope you've enjoyed our TWB Across America Road Trip Series Volume 2, Oregon Coast. Until the next one, beautiful people, stay up, stay true, and do you.